Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Planning and Control meeting. Before we go on, can you please either switch off your phones or put them on silent? One other piece of information: if you see me grimacing or pulling faces, it's nothing to do with the people here. It's just I've had a knee replacement and I'm in agony. Okay. Yeah, and thank you for the Lucozade and the grapes, everybody. Right, okay, item 1, apologies.
Councillor Evans, Chair.
Councillor Sandhu as well, Chair.
Thank you. Late items to be introduced by me, there are none. Declarations of interest. Councillor Holmes.
Thank you, Chair. Committee report item 4 to be considered. It's non-pecuniary, but I think it's fair to say that I've had a lot of involvement ward-wise and communication in regards to this one. I think it's best if I leave the chamber.
Thank you. Item. Councillor Anderson.
Hi there. Yeah, the discussion around Drury Lane. I don't necessarily think it's an interest I'm declaring, but I do live very close to there at the moment, so I will be coming into the debate with an open mind. But I just wanted to make the chair aware that I do live within a close proximity of that property.
Thank you. Not a problem. We all have applications that come in our wards or are close to a house, as long as you don't have any pecuniary interests. Okay, item 4, minutes of the meeting held on the 13th of October. Everybody okay with that? Seconded? Thank you. Item 5, which is the meetings of the Conservation Area Advisory Committee, 15th of September. Thank you. Item 6, appeal decisions, and to tell us about that is Mr. Woodhead.
Thank you, Chair. Essentially on this list there are only really 2 proposals, and I mentioned one of them last time, the 117 Frygate. We got the decision right on the stroke of the last meeting, and I mentioned that it was retention of an ATM. Well, in fact there was an ATM in situ at this particular listed building, and the proposal was for a slightly different, smaller ATM. And so we had to rehearse the issues before the inspector. We refused the applications for listed building consent, planning permission and advertisement consent, and in that case there were 12 paragraphs in the decision letter, and it addressed the adverse listed building impact, talked about the character of the building itself, how it sat within the street scene in terms of opposite the former Gas and Light building and St Werburgh's Church, and the prominent position it held within the conservation area. So that was well rehearsed, and that was dismissed. Now, unfortunately, the second site, 8 Strand, also applications refused for express advertisement consent, planning permission and listed building consent. The inspector came to a different conclusion. Now, it's a bit of a strange one, but he went through the arguments. He quoted the correct bits of the legislation in terms of the Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act, and also the relevant paragraphs in the framework. And he came to a different conclusion because he felt that because this had got a modern shop front and it occupied a different position within the conservation area, he felt that whilst it was a finely balanced decision, he didn't feel that it was going to be detrimental to the character of the listed building or the wider conservation area. So in that decision, which is probably worth a read, particularly for people on Conservation Advisory Committee, it draws out, we referred the inspector to the decision at 117 Frygate and said, I think you need to be mindful of this. It was a different inspector, and there's obviously a contextual issue here. But in his letter, paragraph 14, he said that whilst valid comparisons may be drawn, he did also say in the next paragraph, 15, that other decisions are not binding, and said that there were differences in the characteristics of the proposals that led him to this different conclusion, and the appeals were unfortunately allowed. I think it is worth a read. 8 Strand. He does cross-refer to the Friargate decision, and he tries to come to a different conclusion. I don't necessarily agree, but in this case we have to take it on the chin. But obviously, Chair, we will maintain our rigour with applications like this in the conservation area and those that affect listed buildings. Okay.
Thank you, Ian. Any questions, anybody? No?
I haven't read the full report yet, and I will do, but I'm interested in the surround, this neon, they're usually green, bright green neon surrounds on these, which in conservation areas, to me, are entirely wrong. Nothing against cash machines themselves, even though the one in the Strand is one that rips you off before you get any money out of it anyway. But was there any mention of the surround, or was it just taken as the whole thing?
Well, the ATMs are in situ, but the proposals were for a smaller surround, a different non-illuminated type surround. And so he determined them on the basis of the proposal. So even though he's allowed the ATM at 8 Strand, they've got to remove it within 6 months, the one that's in situ, and replace it with the one that he's obviously granted consent for.
So if we had a policy of no illuminated surrounds in conservation areas, we'd probably get away with it.
Thank you. Item 7, controlled performance. Ian?
Yes, we've got something hot off the press, really, Chair, in terms of we've been talking in previous performance reports about the non-major category that came into effect on the 21st of October. That we got information about that yesterday, and so in terms of the non-major category that we've been including in paragraph 4.2, just for reference, that includes all the applications in the minor category plus changes of use and householders in the other category included on page 2 of your report. There's a new non-major bracket which we will be assessed on, and our performance in that area is currently at 78%, and the current assessment threshold is at 65%. The government laid that down. That will increase to 70% in 2018. So that's something obviously to be mindful of. We've been working towards improving performance on that, so we're pleased that we've exceeded the threshold, and if we just maintain the 78% performance, we'll exceed the threshold in 2018 as well. But we're looking at continuous improvement in that area, so that's something that the government has just confirmed. They haven't released the league tables as to where we are in that non-major category. That'll be released in December. But in terms of the major category, we're currently doing very well. We're at 91% over the performance recording period, which is the last two years minus a month, and we were in the top top 50 planning authorities last time I looked for that out of 300 plus. So that was good to read. And there's also a category of looking at appeals, both in major and non-major categories, and overall, if 10% of appeals are overturned over a particular recording period, then we can also be brought into a particular designation. So I'll double check all the parameters of that for the next meeting, but they won't be coming into effect anyway. That particular measure won't be in effect until 2018 anyway. But we just have to be mindful about how we look at schemes, and if we're looking at refusals, making sure that we've got robust grounds for doing so. But we are pretty conscious of that anyway. So as I say, Chair, I will update you on that particular appeals measure. But in terms of major performance, we're well above the threshold of 60%, and non-major performance, we're in excess of the threshold, and we'll continue to improve on those the applications in those particular categories. And happy to take any questions beyond that, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Well done. Anybody? Councillor Kerr.
Yeah, thank you for that additional information. I was looking at the first table in 4.2 and seeing that there's been quite a reduction in applications from the previous quarter, down by 20 received, 20%. or 20, I'm not sure. Do you know if it's 20 or 20%? It is 20. Oh, it's not as big. I wasn't sure with all the rest of the percentages. Is that normal for the sort of summer period? Or is there a trend?
There has been a bit of a slowdown. I was talking to the team today who received the applications. There have been quite a lot of smaller applications, but we are waiting for some quite big strategic applications in terms of land at Hackwood Farm, DRI. We've got Castlewood Phase 2. We've also got the Infinity Park outline application. So there are some big ones in the wings, but these applications involve master planning exercises, environmental impact assessments, etc. So sometimes, and I try and forecast these things for finance purposes so we can, you know, have a bit of a handle on what's coming in terms of income, and sometimes you can, you know, you're fairly close with predictions because developers will say, well, we've got 3 months of pre-app and then we'll submit the application. Other developers might have other difficult financial arrangements whereby they end up to and fro for some time. So quite difficult to forecast, but there has been a bit of a slowdown in major application submission. But as I say, I had a discussion with our finance team last week, and there's probably £250,000 worth of fees on 6 or 7 jobs. So if they came in, we'd have to just look at how, you know, the capacity works in the team and making sure that we've got the relevant capacity to handle these applications, which we try to monitor and manage on a weekly basis. So that's a current state of play. But as I say, there are things in the wings on a fairly large scale.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? Okay, moving on to item 8, which is the confirmation of the Megalorton Lane extinguishment order 2014, and to tell us about this is Ray Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think the report is quite comprehensive, but just to give extra clarity, I thought I would give a brief overview of the matter. The Council received an application from Network Rail in July 2013 to close the pedestrian crossing at Megalorton Lane. Network Rail considered that it was no longer needed by the public. They had done some of their own surveys, such as CCT surveys and other methods of observation, and noticed very low use of it. The Council investigated the available evidence. That did involve some pre-order consultation, and we concluded that the path, it was expedient to make an order because the path was no longer needed. Yes, there was a very small number of regular users, but whether it was needed by the public at large, we didn't consider so. So we made the order in March 2014, an extinguishment order under the Highways Act. That's to extinguish a 45-metre section of path, which you can see on the screen. There's also a photo of it, which shows that's what the crossing looks like if you've not been there before. It's important to realise this isn't a safety issue. I mean, one of the reasons Network Rail wanted to close the line was that they want to increase line speed because they've promised that to the train companies and the rail regulator. So that was their main driving force for wanting it closed. As I said, we assessed it and we concluded it wasn't needed. There are 2 alternative routes, which you can see. The one with the blue line includes a pedestrian bridge over the railway line that runs by the Rainsway A52 slip road, and the red route, which we believe would be more practical for cyclists, takes you along the main roads, Megalorton Lane, the road section, Celanese Road, and then you would cross the railway line at Spondon Station. So they're not quite as convenient to the local residents perhaps as a crossing, but they're not unduly burdensome. So we advertised the order, we received objections, a number of objections, I think it was 5 and an additional comment. Both the council and Network Rail consulted with the objectors, tried to find ways which would perhaps mitigate the loss of the crossing, and that might make them consider withdrawing their objections. We were unable to do so, so the objections stand. Now, the council cannot confirm an order where there are outstanding objections. Only the Secretary of State can do that. So the choice for members is, and what we've recommended is refer the matter to the Secretary of State for confirmation, or members could choose to withdraw the order if they believed perhaps it was still needed for public use. So that's it, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Comments, Councillor Pegg?
Yeah, sorry, I've read the report, but there's no, I mean, I don't know how many pedestrians actually use the current crossing or whatever the case may be, but there's no actual report, and I've seen where they want to put channels in across the bridge for cyclists, but there's nothing for accessibility for the disabled people to cross there. Do we know what percentage of disabled people use that crossing? Do we know whatsoever on that?
Network Rail have not observed any, in their surveys, any disabled people using the crossing. We, the council, have no evidence of that. I think it's worth noting that because of the location of it, if you had mobility difficulties, you probably wouldn't want to go that way, because not only is the route takes you right out of the way, and it's and I should say, if you're coming from the south and you start crossing, well, you start walking over the crossing, a train coming from the west, the city side, it can approach very suddenly. So, I mean, I did this myself. I started walking. I just opened the gate to start walking across. I heard that the horn go off to the what would be to the left of me, and decided not to cross, and before I knew it, train was upon me. So if you have walking difficulties, you wouldn't go use the crossing, I don't believe. Also, with the bridge, by the Slit Road, that's quite steep steps, so you would have to be quite physically able to go over that bridge by the Slit Road. So I appreciate the point, but I don't think, if you had mobility difficulties, you wouldn't use that route, I believe.
Thank you, Ray. He's managed to cross it and live to tell the tale. Anybody else? Councillor Kerr.
I find this a very difficult case because I support the railways, and I think we ought to be speeding up our railways where we can and improve usage. But also, I've been round these routes, and the alternatives that are there, I don't think, are good enough. So my first point is I was concerned that there was this comment that Network Rail is prohibited from actually improving the alternative route. And I think that that is a problem we've got nationally. So whatever the outcome of this, Chair, I think it's something that we might consider writing to the government, whoever minister it is, to say that they need to look at whether this is the appropriate thing to do, whether we should be enabling Network Rail to say we want changes here and we can fund an improvement that will make that change acceptable, not just for here but for anywhere else on the network. The second thing I noted in the report is that there is this planned improvement in 2018. I think it was 2018. And if there is that improvement being planned, and one of the objectors referred to saying that was going to be an improvement, but you know, maybe that would make it better, then we need to be cognizant of that. The existing path over adjacent to the A52 is, and you described it, Ray, as being really steep, and it is. It's actually quite difficult to push a bicycle up that bicycle track, because I've done it. It's hard work. And coming down feels quite precarious. So I think the comments here that said that as a cyclist you would use the alternative route are absolutely right. You wouldn't choose, I don't think, to use that unless you're a lot younger and fitter than I am. So I've got that as a concern. But at the same time, I do really think that, you know, we are holding back our railways, and there are many more people using our railways, and we know we've got capacity issues on that line. So, Chair, those are my two requests. Well, actually the third one, if we pass it, is that regardless of what happens, is that we need to be aware that we maybe want to postpone this until the 2018 improvements have taken place, that we should write to Network Rail, or the government, to ask that Network Rail be allowed to spend money to improve alternative routes. But also, if we do approve it, then I ask that we have some good signage at all the points so that people who have used this route can use it at another time, because asking how many people are using it for a fortnight at the end of January is very different to the number of people who might be using it in July or August during summer holidays. And I think that the time they've used it, and I don't know if Ray might have a comment on that, of doing a survey at the end of January, is that actually a valid time to do a survey as to assess the number of people using a route? So I have my concerns, but I'd be very pleased to hear what other people think.
Thank you, Councillor Kerr. Robin.
Firstly, I strongly disagree with the idea that if nobody disabled has been seen using it, there's no demand for disabled people to use something. Every shopkeeper who's been asked to put a ramp in has said, well, I haven't got any disabled customers, therefore I don't need a ramp for disabled customers. The reason they haven't got disabled customers is because they haven't got a ramp. This is Network Rail, a nationalised organisation with pretty well unlimited resources. They want to increase the speed of the trains. I'm all for that. Their duty is to make a safe crossing at this point, not to block a crossing. They should do so, and one that is accessible to disabled people, in place of what is not exactly a safe one at the moment. I agree that it's not being done for safety reasons, but we don't know what development there's going to be in that area in the future. We do know that there's a huge area at Celanese that's going to be developed one way or another, so there'll be much more use of this particular Mega Lawton Lane. At the moment, if you go to Albert Looms, very few people will carry on, but there'll be more houses in that area, there'll be more people, there'll be people who want to walk dogs, and so on, and we'll want to cross the line. Now, if you close the official way of doing it, people will do the dangerous way. They won't walk all the way around, and they certainly won't go up that hill by the A52. They'll dangerously cross the railway. What we need there is a proper crossing, a proper bridge that is accessible with ramps, and Network Rail should be made to do it. The decision is not ours, it's the Secretary of State's, and I suggest that we refer this to the Secretary of State and ask that Network Rail do their job properly.
Councillor Anderson.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with much of what Councillor Wood just said. I do think that there, I mean, my opinion always on these foot crossings on particularly mainline railways is I just don't know that they necessarily have a place in modern railway design. And I think there's something that is a little, it's a throwback to a time when trains moved slower. However, I think some of the things that Network Rail have said about wanting to increase the line speed, I'm no railway expert, but I do believe that they won't be able to increase the line speed too much because there is a level crossing just along the line. So I think that that's probably a bit of a misnomer point. I am in favour of you know this being removed, though. I think that, as you know, has been said, it's not about safety, but I think things like this could very quickly become about safety with housing developments. I think Lucy made a very good, Councillor Kerr made a very good point when she said that there is a need for good signage to inform the public that the crossing is now no longer available. Equally, I don't necessarily take on board the point about people crossing the line illegally once that's gone. I think that people, on the whole, that sort of behaviour seems to have been eradicated along the railways. I mean, it's still something that happens in places, but I don't think it's as prevalent as it once was, and our railways are secured. And I think that with modernisation of the Midlands main line, I think that we'll only see further security enhancements. So I think this is a good step, and it pushes us closer to a time where, you know, the very archaic method of crossing a line physically rather than on a bridge or underneath is being removed. So I'm in favour of this.
Thank you. Anybody else? Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I go along with what Councillor Wood has said, and I would add that I have been down there to have a look at this, and I did speak to somebody in Looms who made the point that not many people went down there, but they see quite a lot of children go down, and I see it's in the report. So for safety's sake, this is a good thing if it is closed, because it will possibly save children's lives if nobody else's. So I go along with what Councillor Wood has said, but I agree with my other councillor, and that for safety's sake, I think it's a must to close.
Nobody else? Somebody like to move it to approve the recommendation? Those in favour?
Chair, can we just clarify what we're actually agreeing to? We're sending it to the Secretary of State for a decision.
Yes, Chair. Yeah. The recommendation from the officers is to actually effectively approve the making of the order and forward it to the Secretary of State for him to confirm. That would result, obviously, in the decision being made by the Secretary of State whether to close the footpath. The alternative that you've got tonight is decide not to refer to the Secretary of the State on the basis that you still feel the path is necessary, needed for public and is being used by the public, in which case that is the end of the matter. The path would remain open. So as I say, the recommendation is effectively that you accept that it is not needed for the public because it's expedient to close the path, and to refer to the Secretary of State for him to make a final decision on the matter. In terms just on timescale, obviously that means that the path will not be immediately closed from tonight's recommendation if you decide to follow the recommendation. And it may obviously be several months before the Secretary of State comes to make a decision on the matter. So and that could be potentially the end of next year, obviously, if he decides to have a public inquiry to determine the matter.
I was going to say the objectors will have another chance to put their case to the Secretary of State or an inspector appointed by him.
That's correct. Obviously, the tests are slightly a bit more complicated, or more involved, but similar issues in terms of the need and the expediency will still be considered by the Secretary of State.
Okay. With that clarification, those that are in favour of the recommendation. Councillor Kerr.
Are we allowed to pass comments to the Secretary of State relating to the decision to be taken?
Well, I think in terms of the committee, probably not, because you were really determining whether it's expedient to close the footpath on the grounds that it's not needed or not. And I think for the purpose of tonight's resolution, if you decide to support the recommendation, I wouldn't be suggesting making comments. That said, as individual councillors, you are welcome. You have the ability to make comments yourself directly to the Secretary of State when the matter is determined.
In that case, through you, Chair, may I ask what your advice would be? Because I do think that looking at a survey that was done in January to ask about people's use, people as pedestrians and cyclists, it is very definite. It's on paragraph 419, top of page 8. It does seem a significantly wrong time of year to find out what normal usage is. And I've no idea what the weather was like in that period between the 19th of January and the 2nd of February, the beginning of this year. But if the weather was poor, then I could see people wouldn't be walking their dogs that way. They would be getting in the car rather than cycling or walking to work. But in the summer, they might be using it differently, and we don't have any evidence to that. The other thing, Chair, is that if it does remain open, I would think that we should be asking for forward sensors of trains approaching with lights and things, and an upgrade of the crossing, which it doesn't seem to have at the moment from what Mr Brown was saying.
Yeah, I'm afraid in terms of the evidence and assessment, I'm afraid that that's for you to determine as a committee in whether you are satisfied that as regards whether the evidence satisfies you that it's needed or not. And that's not for me to direct you on that. That's for you to make your own decision on. In terms of requesting the rail authority to put, if it does remain open, that is a point that we can raise, but it wouldn't necessarily, they wouldn't have to. I think they actually are fulfilling their obligations as it is in the way that that crossing is operating.
Thank you. We've had a thorough debate on it. All those in favour of the recommendation? Thank you. That's carried. Just for procedural matters, anybody against it? No. One. Right, moving on to item 9, which is applications to be considered tonight. The first one on your list is pages 1 to 13, land at the rear of 128 Drury Lane. And to tell us about that is Laura Neal.
Thank you, Chair. This full planning application seeks permission for the erection of 14 apartments on land to the rear of numbers 120 to 134 Drury Lane. The application is considered in two parts, the alterations to 126 Drury Lane and the erection of the apartment block. The apartment block will be accessed via an undercroft between numbers 126 and 124 Drury Lane. In order to facilitate the proposed development, the existing undercroft will be widened and the existing ground floor of number 126 will be narrowed by some 1.1 metres. The existing character and appearance of this property will be retained, and there are no concerns with regards to the impact on the character of the street scene from these changes. Amended plans have been received during the life of the application in respect of the proposed apartments. These are sought to reduce the number of apartments from 20 to 14, amend the external appearance of the proposal, and further details have been provided confirming retention of rear pedestrian access to numbers 128 to 134 Drury Lane. The application seeks to provide 2 disabled person car parking spaces, a service vehicle parking space and a turning space with access via the undercroft. Ancillary facilities such as a bin store and cycle store are also proposed. The apartments would benefit from open space to the rear which would be shared between the proposed properties and those on New Toxteth Road, also in the land ownership of the applicant. The apartment block is considered in two parts, the smaller element being a traditional 2-storey design and the main element being of a 1.5 storey. Windows have been positioned in order to minimise overlooking and provide views for future residents over the turning area and private amenity space. The application has been subject to 2 rounds of public consultation, details of which are provided within section 3 of your report, and a summary of the representations received are provided in section 4. The primary concerns and objections received relate to car parking, increased traffic, along with the overall principle of developing on the application site. Drury Lane is involved from its original terrace character following the introduction of student accommodation, residential extensions and residential development. The application site is currently occupied by a series of outbuildings which will be demolished in order to facilitate the proposal. However, these could be brought back into use, and consideration should be given to this. If these outbuildings were brought back into use, given their proximity to existing residential properties, it is felt that the outbuildings could potentially have a greater impact on the residential amenity currently enjoyed by those adjacent properties, and particularly those on Drury Lane, due to the nature of uses that could be taking place. It is felt that the demolition of these buildings and the setting back of the proposed apartment block would create a higher quality living environment for existing residents. Furthermore, the development of the apartments would consolidate the building footprints, allowing for more usable amenity space on the land to the rear of these properties. As discussed, one of the main issues when concerns of local residents is the lack of off-street parking proposed as part of this development. Car-free developments are encouraged and seen as sustainable development, and we have granted permission elsewhere for similar. They are particularly welcomed in sustainable locations such as this, which are in walking distance to the city centre and in close proximity to frequent bus services. Where car-free developments are proposed, residents of such schemes will not be eligible for parking permits. My colleague in Highways Development Control is intended this evening to provide any further advice. Following the submission of amendments, it is considered that the merits of the proposal outweigh any negative implications. The recommendation is to grant with conditions. You have 3 speakers this evening.
Thank you, Laura. The first speaker we have is it Mr. Okai? Good evening, Mr. Okai. You have 3 minutes to speak on this.
Good evening, all. I would urge the Planning Committee to consider this application favourably and endorse granting the permission as recommended by the Planning Officer. Additional information to be considered is in twofold. Firstly, for those of you who have visited the site, it's totally dilapidated, vacant, unused. It's got the unlit and untidy access, the underadapted roads, totally unmaintained and full of potholes. Residents will no doubt confirm that the area is heaven for mischievous youth and adolescents, hideaway for drunks, drug addicts, and immoral activities. Apart from the above, the area is used for dumping grounds for unused furniture, mattresses, causing fire hazard, metal, drums, fridges, needles, and condoms. With the above in mind, this place is unsafe and a total waste, which encourages more burglaries, hence wasting of public resources such as police, fire brigade, and ambulance. This year only, there have been 9 incidents have been called on this site. Secondly, and more importantly, is the National Planning Policy Framework from the central government. It is emphasized in paragraph 29. It encourages car-free developments, hence reducing the greenhouse gases, especially when there is close proximity and availability of public transport, which in turn reduces high emissions vehicles. The councillors that are present here must ratify the officer's report and endorse approval, as Derby City Council not only supports but promotes car-free developments. Policy 6.3 states, quote, "In locations with high public transport accessibility, car-free development should be promoted." Taking the above 2 factors into consideration, the granting of permission will not only uplift the area, but benefit it economically, socially, and environmentally. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Okai. You can rest assured that the councillors here listen to recommendations, but we're not in a position to endorse them all the time. We'll make up our own mind. Thank you. Chair, thank you. she not speaking? No. Next speaker is Ms. Chadwick.
Hello, I'll try not to talk too fast. I own 134 Drury Lane, which is directly in front of the property that's proposed. I'll just read out what I've written. Since plans were first put in for behind 126 Drury Lane in September 2015 and then resubmitted, the consistent objections for all residents on the actual website and through petitions and letters have been regarding lack of parking spaces provided for the apartments on the plans. And we also have objections in regards to the access. Drury Lane is a parking permit street that's up until 6 p.m. every night. There's no way of forbidding people who buy these apartments to not ever have cars and not use them after 6 p.m. The planning application assumes that 14 apartments wouldn't need a car, but as we all know, we use them for shopping trips to the supermarket, jobs that are not in the city centre, transporting children, those sort of activities basically. To build these apartments without providing at least one space per household would have an immediate knock-on effect for all the residents in the surrounding streets. Our nightly return to work will become a desperate dash for gaps in Drury Lane spaces, overflow onto Jackson Street, Wall Street and Boundary Road, which are already full of cars, and it will potentially affect the lives of hundreds of homeowners in the area. Lastly, in regards to this access to the site, we are highly concerned about emergency access, and no matter how much they widen that property at 126 Drury Lane, you're not going to get a fire engine down there, and obviously fires can escalate quickly once it's built. If you can't get something down there quick enough, it can spread to the surrounding properties. It's a very enclosed site, there's no other way of getting to them. I'm also concerned about how they're going to get the building materials to the site if it is put through, because obviously they'd have to crane it over all the properties on Drury Lane and across the car park, which is private land at 138 Drury Lane, which is just to the left of my property, which is the one on the end. And that's obviously a concern for me, especially if it's getting craned over my garden at all times. And that's mainly the main objection. Obviously, it is a bit of a dilapidated site, but it is in use. There are people fixing cars there at the moment, using the garages. They are being used. They are not derelict, and that is something that should be considered, that they are in use. And parking is the main issue for all the residents in the area. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chadwick. We have another speaker, Councillor Russell. I realise you might be new to this, but you've only got 3 minutes.
Good evening, Chair, fellow councillors. Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to speak tonight. I think Emma put things very succinctly. She is here as a representative of the other residents, as obviously I am in my capacity as a local ward councillor. Look, there are a number of reasons for objection that are listed in the report, and I don't intend to go over every single one of them, but the one that I do want to focus on is one that I'm sure every single councillor at one stage or another has been faced with this same issue, which is parking. Parking is a major issue in lots of wards across the city. This particular area of my ward is very, very full of cars. I couldn't think of a better word right then, but it does have numerous cars on the streets. The main consideration here is the fact that there is no parking provision on this site. Now, I appreciate the fact that the National Policy Planning Framework promotes and supports car-free development. I could go on and on and on about the flaws that I think there are in the National Policy Planning Framework, but suffice to say we live in the real world. You know, 14 new apartments that are targeted at young professionals. If there are 14 couples, for an example, that move into those flats, 28 people potentially could own a car each. I know I'm clearly going to the extreme there, but that is a potential 28 cars added to the road, which will not be eligible for parking permits on Drury Lane. Now, Drury Lane is already oversubscribed with cars. It's packed. I used to live on Drury Lane, and I know it was a nightmare to try and get parts on there at the best of times, and I'm sure Emma will tell you the same thing. But actually, what this will then do is displace the parking, because if we don't think that anyone in that development is going to have a car, we're living in dream world. Let's be serious. You know, people in this room are very supportive, as I am, of walking, cycling, public transport, but I bet you about 80% of us got here by car today, at least. I would say, I think there's certain exceptions. Clearly Councillor Wood, and I'm sure Councillor Kerr was on her bike. There's no way she didn't come here on her bike. But that said, I think, you know, it's safe to say that quite a high proportion of people right now in this room came here by car. People have cars. And that is something that we have got to think about, and we have to think about the knock-on effect of the people who live in the surrounding area of this development. I would strongly suggest and request that the councillors on Planning Control Committee give consideration to that and at least put in a requirement, a condition of the planning application that we install some car parking to prevent the knock-on. Very quickly, one of my residents told me the other day that they couldn't get out of Olive Street, which is adjacent to Peach Street and adjacent to Drury Lane. That resident is sat in this room tonight. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you, Councillor Russell. Laura, would you like to come back on some of the points?
Thank you, Chair. I think I'd just reiterate, obviously, we have been in negotiations with the applicant. They have wanted to pursue a car-free development. We have had negotiations with them. The NPPF is clear that sustainable development is supported, and they do promote sustainable development. Our local plan also supports car-free developments, and that's the scheme we have before us this evening.
Thank you, Laura. Members of the committee. Councillor Froggatt.
I actually went to see the site. It's a marvellous site. It's a great site. But there is no parking. You know, shut up. You know, and car-free developments are fine. Like Councillor Russell has said, that there's, can you guarantee that anybody who takes an apartment has no car? You can't put them restrictions on. So I think really we should have a condition on this that says, yes, we should provide some parking.
Thank you, Councillor Froggatt. Councillor Pegg.
I know Drury Lane very well, being brought up in that area, and I'll be quite honest with you, it doesn't matter whether we say there's car-free areas or not, there is going to be vehicles there unless people give a written guarantee that they're not going to let them in 100 years to people who drive vehicles. And to be quite honest with you, I can't see it ever happening. So I will be voting against it because it isn't sustainable in that area. It just isn't good enough.
Thank you, Councillor Pegg. Councillor Anderson.
So as has been mentioned, I do walk that way quite frequently, and I do think that the land being developed is a good thing. I think that there are antisocial behaviours, as the gentleman rightly pointed out, that do happen in that area. But having some personal experience of the issues of parking, I personally don't think the issues will even be felt on Drury Lane. I think the issues will be then disseminated out towards Peach Street and other areas. It is an issue that is widely felt by residents. However, in my own opinion, in my own mind here, I'm having to weigh up the fact that I do think that it does need a development. So I would also be calling for conditions on that as well.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kerr.
I was also somebody who went on the site visit, and one of the things that we were told at that time is that the houses at the front and the new block are all to be used by students as student accommodation. I can't see that as being conditioned here, so that there's an expectation it will be students who hopefully will not be having loads of cars, but I can't see it conditioned, so I can't see anything that would stop it from moving from being students to being other people living there. And I'd like some advice on that. we also talked when we were on the site visit about the crossing point where you gain access to Drury Lane, and at the moment there is a curbed crossing there. There's not going to be any traffic going up and down because no one's going to have any cars, and therefore that needs to be restructured, and I can't see a condition expecting that in the paperwork either. If we have got those two disabled parking spaces, it would imply that the flats, apartments are accessible, at least on a visitability standard, for disabled people. Now again, I can't see that being mentioned, but it would be good to have that confirmed one way or the other, because if they aren't, then I would question why we're providing disabled parking spaces for flats that somebody who's disabled cannot get into. So I expect those to be of at least visitability standard. The access from the front to the front is down several steps. So if you were a disabled person in living in one of those flats or visiting one of those flats, you wouldn't at the moment be able to gain access in a wheelchair from Utoxeter New Road, although that might be the quickest route, both to get to and from the bus. You'd have to go round the edge. So I was just saying that is something else that I would hope to be looked at. And finally, this question about car ownership. Yeah, I have a car. I might have cycled here today. I do have a car. And we do use it because cars are really useful things. And the way to solve that problem, if you're not allowed to park a car somewhere, is to be able to rent it easily. And we have the Co-Wheels Car Club scheme in Derby at the moment. And I'm just wondering whether this is something which we could link into here and see if there's a way in which we could have an additional car parked in this general locality, which would be available to be used not just by residents who live in these blocks, but also any other residents who have occasional need of a car, so that they don't need to park one habitually on the road. So, sorry, several points there, Chair.
Thank you, Lucy.
Do I get any answers, Chair?
If you let me finish, then I was going to ask Mr. Teasdale if he can reply to some of your...
Yeah, I think it would be better for the case officer to deal with the plant condition.
I'm happy to take the questions, but I don't wish to tread on Laura's toes. I mean, I can field the questions if needed.
Laura, are your toes capable of handling Ian?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of the accessibility issues and disabled access for the flats, it's now covered under building regulations rather than the planning process. With regards to the access down to Utoxeter Road, we can condition for further details for that, so to obviously improve that connection. Members have talked about conditioning for car park. At this stage, we'd have to make other changes to 126 Drury Lane to widen the access, and there would have to be changes to the scheme. So it's not something that can simply just be conditioned. We'd have to go back to the applicant to talk about, obviously, the further changes. Obviously, 126 has already been narrowed at the ground floor. To narrow it any further, you then start to potentially question the living accommodation in 126. So it's a conversation that we'd have to have with the agent. Providing car parking on the site would also reduce the amount of amenity space. Obviously, you can see that just north of the apartment block, the area of green that will be shared with those units on Utoxeter Road. It is likely if you were to have car parking, that would be significantly reduced. But again, they are conversations we'd have to have with the applicant and the agent. It's not something we can simply condition.
Thank you, Laura.
Chair, just to add one further comment in relation to the condition on car parking. Given that there's policy support for this to be a car-free, and I'd remind members of the committee that planning is a policy-led matter, and it would be very difficult to justify conditioning, I think, for requiring car parking on this site. I think that would you agree, Laura?
Thank you, Stephen. Robin.
Yeah, I went on the site visit. I was very impressed. I live in this ward. Councillor Russell represents me. Very well, yes. I came here on the bus today, and I'll probably go home by public transport and a taxi. The beauty of this part of the city is its proximity to the city centre. If you live in Stockbrook, St Luke's area, or whatever you want to call it, the city centre is walking distance. That's one of the best things about it, and it's very attractive from that point of view. The people who are going to occupy here are clearly going to be students or people in a similar situation. They have a bus that's laid on specially for them, take them to Derby College and Derby University. So they will come in from the front, from Utoxeter Old Road, Utoxeter New Road. There is, as we all saw on the site visit, a ramped entrance. There's a stepped one near the end of that orange bit that goes up to Utoxeter New Road, but if you follow the tarmac, there is actually a ramp. Clearly it needs a bit of improvement, but that'll be done, obviously. The alternative we've got here is to develop this and stop all the abuses that have been going on there. I don't believe that it's going to make a huge difference to the parking. Yes, parking is a problem. Whatever you proposed here, people are going to complain about parking. Parking actually resolves itself. If you can't park, you don't have a car, or you go elsewhere and come back to it. And why would you want a car if you're a student with a bus service outside your front door and you can walk into town? I don't believe that there is an overriding reason to stop this development going ahead because there's not enough car parking. If we did that, we'd have to do it right across the city, and the Derby would have to be demolished almost. All the terraced areas, all of Strutt's Park would go, most of Normanton would go, because they haven't got room for 2 large 4x4s outside every front door. That would be ridiculous. We haven't actually heard from Mr. Chamberlain on this, but I'm sure he'd tell us the usual thing, that the way these things are calculated, that you don't have 28 cars for 14 small apartments. These are going to be very small student-type apartments. They're not going to need car parking. And if we try turning this down and it goes to appeal, it'll just go against us. We've come to the end of negotiations. It's come down from 20-odd apartments down to 14. They're increasing the size of the entrance onto Drury Lane. I think we should grant planning permission.
Thank you, Robin. Paul Pegg.
Yeah, I've heard all the arguments about the parking, but it's student accommodation. We all know, I've got it in my ward, major issues with students using vehicles. We've got it in and around the Darley area and so on and so forth. So to say that they won't use vehicles, I don't think is strictly true. We've got major issues. We're looking at permits all over the city where there's student parking, and it's creating us havoc, and it will create havoc in this area. And I'm afraid my mind's still not changed. I will be voting against it.
Councillor Anderson.
I don't know if I missed there's no real way of enforcing that it's a car-free. I mean, if you look at the biggest issues, as Councillor Pegg rightly pointed out, in any ward where there are lots of students, but if you also look at one of the biggest issues at the university at the moment, it is around car parking. So I just think that we, as a committee, we really have to be careful when making generalisations about students. And equally, if they don't then also use their car to get to university, you know, we also don't know their shopping habits, we don't know where they go, we're assuming that these people live in a vacuum, and that simply isn't true. I am very mindful of what's been said about this decision being, you know, it's been very difficult at appeal level. But, you know, I really have to take into account the things that the residents have said and the things that have been said this evening when making a decision on that, so I'm going to be voting against.
Councillor Holmes.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just ask, it's probably Sarah or maybe Highways Officer, we talk about relevant policies and we talk about the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework. Can I just have some advice? Because I can't find specifically in the NPPF where it states car-free development. I've searched just, and there isn't, that phrase does not show up, and there's very little about actual parking from what I can see, and I have read the document a few times. I think T4 is probably the local policy that's been adopted in terms of this. My question is this, obviously an overview on that, but specifically, I know that if planning should be favourable towards car-free developments, tell me what the policy is. But there must be criteria within that. Is it that this is suitable because it's in a parking restricted area with permit parking? Is it because it's close to the city centre? There's probably about 5 or 6 criteria that may match. If you could just explain to me a little bit more about that, because this, I think this will be coming up more and more within this committee, and I've had arguments, as other councillors tonight have raised, about parking and being realistic about the parking that is provided in high density developments. So I think we just need to explore that.
Thank you, Councillor Holmes. While Mr. Teasdale, sorry. Yes, Mr. Chamberlain.
Thank you, Chair. I haven't got National Planning Policy Framework here, but I'm not sure it does say car-free development. What it says, though, there is a presumption in favour of sustainable development. What makes this sustainable is that it's fairly close and accessible to bus service, and you can walk into the city. Now, we have gone through the core strategy process, but we haven't got a core strategy yet, and what we've got are safe policies from the old one. And the old one says, and this is Derby City Council's words, car-free development will be encouraged where it's appropriate. Now, you may not like what's in National Planning Policy Framework, absolutely you may not. But that's what the Secretary of State's Inspector will judge it against. And you will have to show that for some reason those policies, so a presumption in favour of sustainable development, so you'll have to show it's not sustainable. And the other thing about this is that the majority of roads adjacent to this site are already controlled. This authority runs a policy where we don't issue permits to car-free for developments that come forward as car-free. And this is what's being proposed, car-free. We don't do that, otherwise it's not car-free. So we don't have a huge control, and I'm not suggesting for 1 second we can't stop people having a car and parking at other places, but we do try and apply some restriction to it, because otherwise it wouldn't be car-free, would it? That would be wrong, to have no parking and then to take up all the spaces on the street. So that's what we actually do about that. You couldn't, in my view, condition that some car parking, there isn't enough room. And the reason that we seek to put in a couple of spaces for disabled people, in case anybody who's disabled wants to take one of the apartments, obviously. So that's why we do that. If you had a car park around this development, then I think you would need to change the standard of the access, because the reason that we've accepted it is the fact it is such low usage. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chamberlain. Ian.
Yeah, just to provide another dimension as well to the sort of national policy context. In terms of sustainability, we all talk about sustainability. This is locationally sustainable in terms of its proximity to the city centre, but in terms of sustainability, in terms of national planning policy, it's about economic, social and environmental sustainability, the 3 arms basically of the sustainability equation. Now in this case, we have got, in terms of environmental sustainability, members who went on the site visit will have noted the buildings there presently. They could be brought back into some kind of reuse. They currently, sort of, as has been highlighted, have an antisocial element to them. So that's part of the environmental equation. Economically, of course, it would bring much needed housing into the area in terms of it being on a brownfield site within the urban fabric and not a peripheral greenfield development. And in terms of the social context, of course, it's providing more housing. And within that context, as Mr. Chamberlain has just alluded to, our core strategy, Local Plan Part 1, has yet to be formally adopted. And in that context, we still don't have a 5-year supply of housing. So the tilted balance of the equation comes into play. So we have no 5-year supply of housing. This delivers small-scale housing in the urban area. So in terms of an appeal situation, if we were to resist this on parking grounds alone, I think we would be, in the words of Stuart Leslie, stranded at appeal. So that's my professional advice. Obviously, over to you to absorb all that.
Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chair. First of clarification, I've been informed, because I asked if there was a footpath from Uttoxeter Road to this site. Can somebody confirm that? And if it is, then, is it a lit footpath, or is it not lit up at all? And where is it on that map?
I'll highlight it, Frank.
So it's the yellow.
That's it.
That's the footpath. Is it then lit?
When we went to site, we moseyed through there, and currently it needs attention. So by condition, we would be looking at not only improving the surface of it and taking out vegetation that's overhanging that boundary. We'd be looking at some form of boundary treatment around that little rear garden of that nearest property to provide some amenity relief there as well. So there would be attention to it, and as Councillor Wood mentioned, there is a ramped access in front of the dwelling fronting Uttoxeter New Road, and also there are steps down which we could seek to improve by condition. So in terms of accessibility, we'd be looking at access through Drury Lane and then through down that side onto Uttoxeter New Road.
And will you put a condition in regarding light in that footpath?
I think that would be reasonable, yes, because that's a flank boundary, and yeah, that's something we could reasonably attach by condition.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to carry on.
I think we've debated this for a very long time now, and most of the answers that could be given have been given. So would somebody like to... Sorry,
Chair, when we made the visit, one of the things that we were mindful of is that this is not a public footpath, and there is no current right of way through that site. And I'm therefore a bit cautious about the idea of saying that path ought to be lit. I think that if you are a resident there, it'll be your local area and you will know the people who are around there. But I think if it were lit, I think it actually might make it more attractive to people to use that as a cut-through, and that might be to the detriment of the development. Okay. So I'm not, we did talk about gates as well, you're right, Councillor Wood, but I don't think it's an instant obvious suggestion that lighting it is going to make it better.
Ian?
Well, yeah, we did discuss on site the need to gate it either end so it's secure for residents only, because as you remember, as we were on site, as we were leaving the site, somebody came and introduced themselves to us who was wandering through. So it would improve the current situation and obviously make it clear for future occupants that they can leave, but they've got a safe access at either end. So we could deal with that by condition. We could deal with all those factors by condition in terms of the dropped and taper curb onto Drury Lane that you mentioned, the gated access, and also the surfacing through the site as part of the overall landscaping scheme. So those components can all be dealt with by condition. That's reasonably dealt with by condition. But as Laura mentioned, that's the scheme before you. We're not going to gerrymander the building and talk about where we're going to squeeze the parking, because we've got where we are now, and that's the scheme before you. That's the building, that's the parking, and it's kind of over to you, members.
Chair, I'd like to carry on, please, because I've got other points to make, if you don't mind.
Sorry, Frank, I thought you'd finished.
No, I hadn't. I did state I hadn't finished. I just wanted a clarification first. Okay. Chair, they say there's no parking on the site. Well, there is, of course. There's allocation of 2 disabled places. First of all, I'd like to make the point that my wife's got a disabled badge, and there's nothing more infuriating than going to a place and find people without disabled badges parking in disabled car places. This will happen here, of course, because it clearly states that 2 disabled parking places for use by residents or visitors. Well, are the visitors all going to be disabled then? I guess not. So they'll take the disabled places. And human beings, what they are is, yes, I agree with Councillor Russell entirely. People will have cars, no matter whether they're students or not. In fact, most students nowadays at 17 do want a car. You know, the grandparents will provide one, or somebody of that ilk, or parents even. Okay, I provided one for my granddaughter. And quite honestly, I didn't go on the site visit, I went on the visit myself. And I walked down Drury Lane, and the speaker we had earlier, who lives in Drury Lane, made the point about cars being parked both sides of the road, indeed they are. I walked down there and I saw 6 cars that didn't appear to me to have a permit. 6 cars that didn't have a permit. These people will have cars and they'll park without a permit, and who's going to monitor that? I take it that, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we haven't got the facility to keep monitoring this, and the people in Drury Lane are going to have a very, very rough time with this going on. I think this site wants something doing on it. I really do. I agree with the gentleman that came along and told us what it was like, because I agree with him, it probably is. But the fact is this, you can't ignore the fact that people have cars. Even then, you know, in 5 years' time, are there still going to be student flats? Can you guarantee that? Is it put in the legal requirements of owning one of these appointments, so you've got to be a student? Well, you know, I've heard something about 28 cars and what have you. If that's going beyond, I'm going beyond probably, but you cannot guarantee that in years to come, these will be for students. So you've got to look at it realistically. And you've got to look at it from the point of view. I'm not against the site, I'm not against the application, I think it's a good one. But some provision's got to be made for parking. And if you're going to have disabled parking there, who's going to monitor that? Sorry, it won't be monitored. People will park in there. The students will park in there. And who's going to tell them that they can't do it? Chair, I share the problems that this will certainly make in Drury Lane. I feel for the people in Drury Lane, and I think realistically there's got to be a rethink on this to accommodate some cars.
Thank you, Frank. As you know, we can't ask any applicant to guarantee who's going to live there, whether it's 5 months, 5 years, or 25 years, right? Now, one more last speaker, Councillor Froggatt. You've had your hand up for about 10 minutes.
Just going back to the footpath from Utoxeter Road, when we was on the site visits, we discussed the lighting and the gate, you know, the lock gate, but it was the proximity to the windows of the building at the side. You could literally tap on the window as you walk past. You know, is there going to be some form of screening up there just to give them some privacy and then apartments there?
Ian?
Yeah. I mean, we can deal with that by condition as part of the overall landscaping scheme. And following the site visit, I did send an email to the agent to say there are a number of issues that were raised at the site meeting. The dropped and tapered curb crossing on Drury Lane, the overall landscaping component, the issue of gated access at either end, and additional cycle parking that Councillor Kerr raised on site as well. So all those issues were flagged up with the agent, and obviously, you know, the issue of cycle parking was relative to visitor parking, so that was something else that was highlighted, and we can address by condition and supplement those conditions in the report.
Thank you, Chair. Would somebody move it to the vote?
No, I want to propose deferring this, because we haven't talked about the option which I think will get the cars off this system, which is to enable people to have access to the Co-Wheels, the car club.
No, we can't do that. Lucy, you have a recommendation, and I'm asking for people. We've had an hour on this, and all we're doing is asking the same question in different...
No, what I'm asking is that we talk to the applicant, unless he's already had this discussion, to say £5 per month would give...
No, I'm afraid that's not something for us to do.
Chair, sorry, I don't think that would be a justifiable condition on this particular site.
I'm not suggesting it as a condition, I'm suggesting we have a conversation.
Well, I think even that would not be sort of appropriate. I think it's a matter for committee whether they want to defer, obviously, on your suggestion, but it probably wouldn't take us any further in relation to the matter. I think sorry, Chair, if I can just make one comment before you go to the vote. I think in terms of the way that an inspector would approach it, if you did decide obviously to refuse it tonight, I think Ian sort of well set out the sustainability of this site. So the main concern that has been expressed sort of by both by members and the objectors and Councillor Russell, relate really to the parking on site. And the question that you've really got to ask is, or the inspector would be asking himself, is can that be adequately addressed? And you do have, obviously, a residence parking scheme, and certainly, obviously, as Councillor Harwood said, it might be suggested that, well, it's not being enforced, but the inspector would simply say, well, that's for the council to do. So the question is, will, you know, effectively, the scheme itself will prevent parking and prevent usage. And I think Councillor Russell correctly said, well, that may well cause problems elsewhere. But I'm not convinced in my own mind that an inspector would put a great deal of weight on that point. But it is obviously, I'll leave it to members to consider. So.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, enforcement is not part of our duties, but I understand the concern. So, would all those in favour of the recommendation? All those against? The application is refused. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Application is granted. Mr. Ockeye nearly had a heart attack then, right? Moving on to application number 2, pages 14 to 28. The erection of 34 dwelling houses and associated access at Brindley Park. And to tell us about that is Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Members will recall that this application was deferred at the last meeting for a committee site visit, which took place on the 2nd of November, and there have been no updates to the application since the previous committee. To the main body of the report, the proposal is a cross-boundary development for housing on a greenfield site south of Chellaston. Full permission is sought for 34 dwellings, associated public open space and a drainage pond facility. Development is all sited in South Derbyshire District, except for the vehicular access, which is within the city, and will be served up a permitted scheme for 54 dwellings on land off Woodlands Lane, which is now known as Brindley Park. Principal access to this development is served off Woodgate Drive in Chellaston, which is to the north of the site. Proposed housing is part of the Chellaston Fields allocation in South Derbyshire's Local Plan Part 1 for up to 500 dwellings south of Chellaston. This plan has recently been adopted and the site is in the northeast corner of the allocated site. Chellaston Fields allocation is also referenced in the Council's Core Strategy Local Plan Part 1 under Policy AC24. The application site forms part of a cluster of cross-boundary sites which are identified for housing growth in the AC24 policy. Core Strategy has now completed its consultation on the final modifications and does carry some weight in the decision-making process. The Inspector's report is expected to be published shortly. The only part of the proposed residential development which the City Council is being asked to consider here is the means of access to the site from the Woodlands Lane development. The proposal is for a 20-metre stretch of road which would form vehicular access to the site. The access would be an extension to the permitted access road through Brindley Park, which is served off Woodgate Drive. It also includes part of the public right-of-way, which runs from Woodlands Lane into South Derbyshire to the east of the application site. For members' information, there is an extant outline permission for the Chellaston Field site in South Derbyshire, which does not include the current application site. This outline includes means of access, and under the permission there is no proposal for access to this site to be taken from Chellaston Field, other than pedestrian and cycle routes. The proposed access road from Woodgate Drive would be the sole vehicular route to serve this development. The only material considerations which should be taken into account in determination are in relation to the access and its traffic impacts on the road network and highway safety issues. Protection of the public right-of-way is also a consideration. The traffic generation and highway safety implications have been fully assessed by the Council's Highways Officer, and overall we are satisfied that the proposed access would not have an adverse impact on the city's road network and would form a safe and suitable access to the development. In consideration of the access, members should have regard for the local plan context and the overarching MPPF in regard to delivery of housing growth and all other material considerations. The principle of new housing on this site is allocated in both South Derbyshire and the City Council's core strategies. However, it is ultimately a matter for South Derbyshire Council to determine the matters of principle, design and layout of the housing on the site. We are only considering the merits of the proposed access. There are no overriding policy or technical concerns with the proposed access, and the development is therefore recommended for approval. You have 3 speakers.
Thank you, Sarah. We have 3 speakers on this. The first one is Neil Arbon. I'm sure you're not new to this, Mr. Arbon, but it's 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Decision for this application, I'd like to begin by fully endorsing the positive recommendation of your planning officers. As is made clear in the officers' report, presentation and at the previous planning committee, the application before this evening is for means of access only for a proposed residential development of 34 houses, which is located within the administrative area of South Derbyshire and subject to a separate planning application for their determination. I'd like to stress this application is separate and therefore not linked to the 400 dwellings proposed on the site known as Chellaston Fields. As the officer's report concludes, there are no outstanding technical objections to the access, and the proposed access is being considered by the Council's own highways officer as acceptable in terms of highway safety, and the traffic impacts on the wider road network will not be severe. It is therefore respectively requested that you will follow the recommendation of your officers and approve this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arbon. Nice and quick. Mr. Bowden.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to address the committee. I represent the Chellaston Residents Association, and I would like to speak against the application. The reasons are that the main access to the site is proposed to be from Woodgate Drive, which was actually built to serve the existing high number of properties along its length, but not designed to act as a thoroughfare for a new development of the size envisaged. The width of the road is only that of 3 cars, and it has a sharp bend with very poor forward vision at one point. Parked cars are frequently encountered along the whole length of the road, and if the road were to have to accommodate an extra 64 vehicles from the development, plus service vehicles, the potential for accidents, we feel, is high. Land to the south and west of the proposed development is being developed for the Chellaston Fields development in South Derbyshire. And I'm not sure why developers never talk to one another or why it has never been suggested to them previously, but it would make a lot more sense for the access to the development which you're considering to be through the Chellaston Fields development, because that's got a much easier access directly to the A514, A50 junction. And this would avoid the need to put extra vehicles through Woodgate Drive. A further significant point is that this is one of several new large-scale housing developments in and around Chellaston at the moment, each of which will contribute hundreds more vehicles to Chellaston's already grossly overcrowded roads, giving significant road safety problems, particularly for school children. If permission is granted for this access to the site, and we request the committee not to do this, we would eventually expect there to be a substantial S106 contribution for the improvement of road infrastructure and also the provision of facilities such as schools. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bowden. Councillor Ingle.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to speak. I think a lot's already been said about how many cars are going to be using our infrastructure. This is in South Derbyshire, it's not in Derby City. We're going to have all the problems, none of the money to deal with those problems. So one thing I'm going to say to you is, it works, look. All this area here is going to be housing. This area here will be sooner or later as well. And what we're saying is, we're already building these houses here. Why don't we just use the correct access point, which is just over here, directly onto the A514, lovely road comes round and we'll service all of this. Rather than, what's going to happen is this road will link up with this bit here, and when this junction here is busy, it'll be used as a rat run to go through all round there. Like nasty road, and it is a nasty road. It's got a nasty bend on it, lots of car spots. I understand that the time that you went on your site visit was 9 o'clock in the morning. My constituents were all at work. So there was no cars parked on the roads. There was probably no cars parked on the drives because my constituents were all at work. But when we have times when people are commuting, you know, before 8 in the morning, or as my understanding is your visit was 9 a.m, they've already gone. It gets extraordinarily busy. Where Glenwood Road is here, that comes onto Woodway, this is actually quite a wide road. And it actually gets into it. This is a terrible rat run. I live just on that road there. This is already a really fast road, coming into a very nasty corner to come up here. This is going to be a very fast, nasty bend on there. There is going to be terrible accidents. What I'm saying is, and I've spoken to officers about this, you can reject it and say, yeah, what I think your better option is, use this junction here, because you're already building an infrastructure, and just use that road for these houses, because it's not going to be much more than what this junction can handle. So I would suggest that you reject this, because that is going to cause a massive problem, and there will be accidents, and the blood will be on your hands if you pass this, let me assure you. So please reject it, and make a suggestion that they use the other access directly onto the A514, which is that's what it's built for. Thank you. It's quite nice, that, Ian. Cheers, I'll keep that.
I wouldn't put it past you. Thank you, Councillor Ingle. You can sit down now. Sarah.
Just a few things to come back on, just to remind members, this is the application that we are being asked to consider. This is the access that we've been asked to consider. Any proposals that may or may not come forward for access off Chellaston Fields is not something we can consider tonight. In terms of 106, there are contributions for the South Derbyshire side for education, but in terms of road improvements, I think it has been agreed that because of the amount of traffic is relatively low, it doesn't justify any traffic contributions on this scheme. South Derbyshire have the adopted local plan which includes this site. Ours is nearly adopted and includes this site for housing, and there are no technical objections, but I will defer to Mr Chamberlain if there's any particular issues on the access that he wants to raise.
Thank you. Mr Chamberlain.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points then. We hear it lots and lots every time we get an application, don't we, that each house produces 2 cars in the peak hour. Well, it's just not true. I understand why people say that, but when we assess these things, we use a database of measured traffic surveys. And I've applied to this what's called 85th percentile rates. So effectively, there's only 15% of sites will generate more than this, and the busiest time would be in the evening PM peak, when there would be approximately 26 two-way movements. So that's just to cover that. I've had a look at the accident record of the road which takes it to the network, including the bend that's been mentioned today. There aren't any accidents. It's a fairly standard width road generally, 5.5 metres. Yes, there are cars parked on it, but I can see no grounds for turning it down. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chamberlain. Councillor Holmes.
Sorry, Chair. I was just talking to a fellow councillor there. I know this area well. I'm not going to repeat what I've said at the previous meeting about this. I was a councillor for 8 years at Chellaston. Mr. Bowden, Councillor Ingle are absolutely right in terms of their assessment of the road and roads leading to this potential access. I'm not happy. I don't think it's an issue, as the office suggested, about quantity, although you know, some of these houses are going to have 3, maybe 1, maybe 2 cars, so they won't have 2 each, some will have 3, one will have 1, but there's going to be a significant quantity of cars that are going to be travelling through this access if it's passed. But it isn't about the quantity. Even if we say the lowest estimate of 1 car per dwelling, it's still a significant amount of traffic movements, and it's about the safety of those movements, not the quantity. And nothing that has been presented to me now, in comparison to last time, has convinced me anything other than to oppose this, Chair.
Councillor Kerr.
I was pleased to go on this site visit, and by the time we left it was probably about 10 o'clock. The roads were pretty clear. But as I drove down to the bend on Woodgate, there was a white van parked on the near side, inside of the curve, where the big curve is going around that road. And I was incredibly wary about going past it because the visibility was absolutely appalling. And you know, I don't think there's an issue with the amount of traffic. I think we've actually got a road there where the visibility is an issue if anybody is parked. If it was a low sports car, I'd see over the top, but it wasn't. It was a white van. And I just wonder whether there's actually that highways safety issue, and I think that's probably the key point, because if you can see the vehicles, if you can see the obstruction, if you can see people coming towards you, drivers are sensible. But it's if you can't see that you have a problem. So I would like advice as to whether we actually ought to be putting some sort of parking restrictions on that curve. There isn't immediately parking housing there, and whether that would actually make that route safer. Because from my understanding, from the planning officers, we haven't actually got a strong reason otherwise for turning it down. The layout of the site in South Derbyshire, I really dislike the layout of that South Derbyshire site, because if you can bring it up again, that indicative layout, to me, has a road that could potentially go through to the next set of sites, as much as the one from the site that they're currently building is going through. The next one has a road at the end there which potentially could go through. And I don't like the fact that we've not got any control over that. Apparently we can't say, no, you're not allowed to let anybody else through this road that we're just allowing now. I may be wrong there, and I'm very pleased if we can correct that. But for me, it isn't the loading on the road, it's that bend. And can we do anything about the safety of that bend and condition that as part of giving the approval here?
Mr. Chamberlain.
Thank you, Chair. Can we just be clear? There's no evidence that the road's unsafe. Let's be really clear about that. There's no evidence. I'm afraid you can't condition traffic regulation orders. You can't do that because it's a separate democratic system. So you would have to say no development takes place unless and until that order, which is a very tortuous way, and I'm sure my planning colleagues would agree that that's fairly difficult to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chamberlain. Councillor Kerr, I mean, no matter where, when or how, you will always find people motorists who are inconsiderate and, you know, engage in this idiotic scenario where they park knowing that they could cause accidents or knowing that it's convenient. So we can't legislate simply because you saw a white van parked there. you know, this is going to happen not just on that particular bend, but it happens every day. It happens next to school crossings. So I'm afraid, you know, there's nothing that we can legislate in terms of a individual behaving like that. Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chair. I'm perturbed about this road. I went at 5 o'clock to have a look at this, and I found that there was quite considerable parking on this road, which certainly restricted the width a great deal. And I agree with you, Chair, that if you tried to put some kind of parking restriction on the road, people would just ignore it anyway. You've only got to come to my ward and say how to park on double yellow lines, single lines, grass verges and what have you, and people will do this no matter what, and it could cause a danger. So I agree with both the person that's come to speak on behalf of Chellaston Ratepayers Association and the local councillor. This is a time we've talked tonight about the request of Network Rail to divert traffic away from their level crossing and use an alternative way, which may be longer. And I agree with them that in this case, we should request or turn this down, and they use the A514 to come to this site. And I also met the point, of course, that South Derbyshire were getting all the monies, etc. And if we are going to do something about it, and it is passed, then we should make sure that we get a good contribution from South Derbyshire for anything that we can put in to make this road much safer, including widening it if need be.
Thank you, Councillor Harwood. Councillor Anderson.
Yeah, I went on a site visit to this proposed development. I mean, for me, and it was at 9 o'clock, and as Councillor Ingle rightly says, but for me, I saw no issue that is additionally put on the road by this bit of the development. And I also, while I do have a lot of sympathy for the road that comes from the A514, and I possibly do think that one day they will connect, I also think it'd be an extremely illogical rat run that I don't think motorists would take. I'm not sure why anyone would go through Chellaston to come back on themselves. So, I mean, you know, I was happy with everything I saw when I was there, and the road seemed to be wide enough. And also there is a development that is being built at the moment, and this won't add anything additional to that. So purely on that, I'm going to be voting.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. Councillor Wood.
Yes, I went on the site visit and thought what a desirable place this will be to live, overlooking the entire city. It's an extremely attractive place. People who want to live there will be wanting to get off to the south more than probably drive into the city centre. They want to go to the airport, they want to go to the M1, the M6, the A50. This is all about a border which soon or later will go, and this will all be part of the city. That is obvious. And I think from a planning point of view, we really need to look wider than a border. Our officers are paid to look up to a border. South Derbyshire's guys in swaddling coat will look the other side of that border. In a few years' time, if we were looking at this application, our officers would say, you can't possibly want everybody to go back through that way. You'll want them to go out the other way. And they'd have knocked a few developers' heads together. And that's exactly what the people in swaddling coats should be doing, to get a proper access out to the roundabout by the Bonnie Prince there to serve this. Because there's going to be more development further along in the fullness of time. And we should be looking long term. We should be looking at the issues that will come when these places are built. To allow access through there, well, all right, yeah, the road is wide enough, 5.5 metres is adequate, and actually park cars, slow traffic down, but and it's not very nice for the residents and so on, but that's not enough grounds to turn down housing in a particular area like this. But I do think if we stuck our heels in a little bit by putting down a refusal at this point, South Derbyshire would say, well, is there a way around this without involving the city? Would we get another access and perhaps an emergency exit out into the city there? That would make an awful lot more sense. It's just a question of timing. And all right, we may end up in an appeal, but won't it concentrate the minds of these developers to say, well, look, isn't there another way we can do this without going to appeal over that tiny bit of the city's land? And I think it goes against my principles to a degree, but I think if we could find a reason for a refusal on this application on the grounds that it's premature in the fact that the whole site hasn't been properly planned and interconnected, that we might just get the result we want. I know Stephen Teasdale's shaking his head, but I look at things from a common sense point of view, and that's what we really need to be doing.
Thank you, Robin. Whilst I agree with you that maybe we can dig our heels in a little bit, but I'm afraid on this particular application, it may be too late to start thinking about doing that. Maybe in future, the officers can, talk to whether it's South Derbyshire or Amber Valley or whatever, and say, look, the committee, is it sort of mindful not to approve things like that, and let's see where we go. But for this particular application, I'm afraid we're a bit too late to be digging our heels in. So with that in mind, all those in favour of the recommendation? Anybody against? 5-3. Yeah, that's approved. Right, moving on to item 3, pages 29 to 47, the erection of the anaerobic digestion facility at Rainsway. I think some of us, maybe 4 or 5 of us went to see this, and to tell us about this is Sarah again.
Thank you, Chair. This is an application for an anaerobic digestion facility at the Severn Trent Sewage Works, which most people will be familiar with. Full permission is sought for a facility which would sit alongside the existing sewage plant and is for the purpose of recycling and processing of organic waste, primarily food waste, to form methane gas, which is then used to produce renewable energy. The electricity generated would be for the use on site and also for feeding into the national grid. The remaining byproduct that is produced would be used for fertiliser for farmland. Development, which comprises a reception building, various tanks and infrastructure, will be sited on the southwest corner of the main sewage treatment works, on vacant land close to the River Derwent, which is shown on your plan. It is land which was within the sewage works and would be accessed via the main works entrance on the Eastern Service Road, which is shown in the red dotted line. The waste is to be transported to the site via HGVs sourced from various commercial operators, schools and hospitals, and the facility is intended to operate 24/7. The majority of the application site is identified for employment use in the adopted local plan under policy EP11, but a small part of the southern boundary of the site is within the Green Wedge, and policy E2, which is carried forward in the core strategy, policy CP18, restricts development within green wedges, and industrial development is not one of the appropriate types of development under this policy. The affected part of the development would therefore be contrary to E2, and the harm must be weighed against the benefits of the proposal. As a waste facility, the proposal is also considered under the adopted Derby and Derbyshire Local Waste Plan and the MPPF for waste management. Both national and local policy contexts support the reduction of organic waste going to landfill, and the preference is for waste recycling and energy recovery in appropriate locations. Anaerobic digestion is recognised nationally as a means of producing energy from food waste and thereby reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The traffic impacts of the proposal have been assessed by the Council's Highways Officer, and since the site would be accessed largely from the trunk roads of Rainsway and the A52, development is considered unlikely to have a significant impact on the local road network. The proposed waste plant also has the potential to have impacts on air quality as a result of noise, odours and pollutants due to the nature of the processes operating on the site. However, the Council's Environmental Health Officer is satisfied that such impacts on nearby dwellings and commercial properties would be limited due partly to the relatively remote location of the site. In respect to other environmental impacts on flood risk, landscape quality and visual impacts and ecology, we are satisfied that these effects would be limited and could be mitigated by the use of planning conditions. The ecological impacts have been confined to the displacement of badger activity in the vicinity of the site, and this can be satisfactorily mitigated under a Natural England licence and a mitigation strategy which would be secured by condition. In terms of the overall planning balance, the loss of a small piece of green wedge and limited harm to ecological interest is considered to be outweighed by the substantial benefits of the proposal in the provision of waste recycling and renewable energy generation in a sustainable location. So overall, there are no overriding policy concerns with the proposal, and it is considered to be acceptable in this location, subject to the recommended conditions. The application is therefore recommended for approval.
Thank you, Sarah, and you'll all be pleased to know there's no speakers on this. All those in favour of the recommendation? Thank you. None against. Very quickly moving on to item 4, pages 48 to 51. 23 Fairborn Drive, Micklover, and to tell us about this is Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Just one update for the report. As you can see on page 49, consultations, Arboricultural Officer comments to be reported. Well, I can confirm that he went out last week, visited the site on the 17th. His comments and photographs have been circulated. We obviously sought his specialist advice because we'd got concerns from a neighbour and other people in the locality. But his advice is clear, and I consider that the recommendation as printed, plus the safeguarding conditions, are reasonable in this case. And you've got Councillor Keith and Mr Richards to address you. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have Mr Richards first. Councillor Keith can wait.
The report, as I understand, is the officer's opinion. The 2010 approved application stated works 25 years earlier. My understanding is that the current application is a different tree specialist to that of 2010, and the application to the oak was to prune branches to the boundary of 21 Fairborn Drive, where I live. Amazed that the planning department agreed to such works. Oaks are slow growing and do not need constant pruning, totally unheard of within any other location, not to mention over a neighbour's garden. Belief is that the application to the oak, which we love, was made in spite, following our developing disputes with the applicant. The officer refers to E9. Trees are an important wildlife habitat and protects mature trees for their biodiversity value, and where trees contribute significantly to visual amenity, woodland is a scarce resource in Derby and it represents an important wildlife habitat. Works in 2010, wildlife population suffered. The officer considers the application is acceptable but does not mention wildlife. The officer acknowledges central government guidance where the condition of the tree is not severe enough to use the dead, dying and dangerous exemptions. Written evidence must be provided with the application describing the nature of the problem, its impact and justifying the work proposed. The applicant has not provided such evidence. The ash within the application do not suffer from Chilara dieback. Infected chainsaws, clothing and boots may introduce the disease, and the site's brook would distribute it. The oak tree has grown insignificantly since 2010 and has not posed any threat since our arrival 24 years ago. Reducing the weight on the union would mean reducing the tree significantly to a bare stem. The hawthorn works are to manage the size and shape. We're talking about a TPO here, ladies and gentlemen. The applicant, now retired, keeps a tidy and neatly trimmed garden. The application confirms that the trees are not diseased and there is no fear that they might break and fall, with no fear of damage to property. The Secretary of State's TPO view is that to enhance public confidence in the planning system, by allowing the application to succeed, it would make a mockery of TPOs, open the floodgates for applications, set precedents and fail the Council's policies, not to mention central governments. There are no logical reasons why the application can be approved in order for the applicant to continue his retirement in a tidy and neatly trimmed garden, assumedly renewing his application a few years' time. This now needs to stop here at this committee. As stated, there is a continuing neighbour feud. I've been supported by a local councillor, but this issue is not politically biased, it's just plain common sense. I therefore urge you to dismiss this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Richards, just on time. Councillor Keith, Mr. Richards went over by 10 seconds, so we'll be deducting that from you.
As a Micklehove councillor, I've asked to speak on this application to pass on to the Planning Committee the concerns of a neighbour of the applicant. He feels that if the application is approved and the work carried out to crown reduce and crown raise the trees protected by tree preservation orders in his neighbour's garden, including one of which hangs over his own garden, this would have a massive detrimental effect on his own amenity as well as his other neighbours who have objected. He feels that the value of these large trees with excellent form would be greatly diminished not only to the immediate neighbours but also to the wildlife and the environment. The trees in question are part of a heavily wooded area at the rear of the premises, and he believes they play a significant part along with other trees in creating the unique character of the area. His concerns include the detrimental effect that the tree work would have on the squirrels, bats, insects and birds and other wildlife in the area. He believes that the trees in question identified for crown reduction raising are healthy trees, as agreed in the planning application itself, do not pose any danger to the applicant and are situated far enough from his dwellings so not as to cause damage to his property. It did occur to me that the Council's tree management policy, which states, and I quote, "When considering requests for tree work, the first consideration would be the impact on the community. For example, work is not usually done that benefits an individual, which means a loss to the community." End of the quote. And this is being ignored in this case. Micklehove has a massive problem with trees, which figure near the top of the constituents' complaint chart. And it would seem to me that our tree policy needs to be clearer when it comes to approving or refusing applications for TPO tree work to be carried out. I would appreciate it if the other officers responsible for trees please explain to me why it appears that if residents complain about council-owned trees causing a nuisance, the answer is, sorry, they are protected trees. Whereas if they are privately owned trees, permission is usually granted.
Thank you, Councillor Keith. Ian, would you like to come back on anything?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I do appreciate the concerns of Mr. Richards, and it is an attractive wooded area that's covered by this woodland order. But in terms of this application, the content of the application is in line with the regulations. I mean, I'm not qualified to judge the works proposed, so we defer to our specialist, our council's arborist. There's only one or two of them left now, but he went out on site. He spent 45 minutes on site. He looked at the oak tree and the ash trees and the hawthorn, and in his email he does say he has no objections to the proposals. He refers to the British standard which governs the tree works and the adequacy of those tree works. And in terms of the issues about wildlife, there's also other legislation in the Wildlife and Countryside Act that anybody would have to be mindful of when carrying out such works. And normally people do appoint reputable arborists to carry out the work. This is something that we obviously have considered, I think, fairly. We've sought the advice of a specialist, and his advice is that the recommendation is sound. So I would move the recommendation, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Anybody? Okay. All those in favour of the recommendation? Anybody against? Recommendation is carried. Right, to the most exciting part of the evening. You can tell Councillor Holmes to come back now, if he hasn't sneaked off. Welcome back, Matthew. I saw you heading towards the stairs, that's why I thought I'd better get this over with quickly. Bless you. Right, most exciting part of the evening, major site visits.
Number 1, Chair, the Audley Centre. It's application to raise the height of the building. I think you can see this from a number of vantage points in the city centre.
Anybody dying to go and see that? No. No. Is that it? Right, well, that
number 2. This sits in the southeastern corner of this industrial park, former Qualcast QDF site. Right in the corner. It's a B2 workshop. General industrial use, fairly standard stuff, really.
Okay.
25 to 33 Babington Lane. It's to convert the building and raise it by a couple of stories to give 81 studio apartments. They're pretty small, ranging between 19 square metres internal to about 35, 36 square metres. You can obviously appreciate this from a number of vantage points, but Councillor Harwood?
What was there? What is there now? Well, what was there? Can you just tell me? It was the lights electrical, was it?
Yeah.
Oh, it was, yeah.
It's got a sort of arrowhead design, and then they're extending it both flanks. That's it.
Well, you used to go there, Frank, you should know.
Number 4, Goodman's site, big industrial, B1, B2, B8, big storage and distribution, massive floor plate. You can, yep. And the former TDG Novacold, there was a big, obviously, as is the title of the previous user, it was a big refrigerated building in there, and there was back in the mid-2000s when there was lots of money slushing around in the residential market, there was an outline application for residential granted on part of that site. Richard Hartley was interested in lots of parcel terrace at one time, but didn't have an interest in this. But this is just an application to use the land for storage and distribution of cabins and kit associated with construction work. Ooh, I wouldn't possibly comment, Councillor. It's just a large site, hence why it's a major application. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ian. With all your promotion, they still don't want to go and see it. It just remains for me to say thank you for attending tonight's meeting. Good night, and see you soon.